That means you're extraordinary.
Give it up, gonna be alright. Give it up, gonna be alright. Give it up, gonna be alright. All night, alright. With you, why do you gotta? All night, alright. So slow. Give it up, gonna be alright. All night, alright. With you, why do you gotta? All night, alright. So slow. Give it up, gonna be alright. Give it up, gonna be alright. Give it up, gonna be alright. All night, alright. With you, why do you gotta? All night, alright. With slow. Give it up, gonna be alright. All night, alright. With you, why do you gotta? All night, alright. So slow. Give it up, gonna be alright.
Perfect. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center. We're pleased to welcome you in the room and those who are watching virtually. We are going to have a phenomenal program tonight with the New York Times bestselling author and acclaimed historian, Dr. Douglas Brinkley. The Frank and Kula Kumpuris Distinguished Lecture Series is presented by the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton School of Public Service, the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum, and AT&T. Since 2006, this series has welcomed 35 incredible speakers to Little Rock. Please join me in thanking the Kumpuris family for this incredible gift. I'm so pleased that Dean is here tonight and his lovely wife, and Drew and Katherine Trotter. Thank you again for this really, really special gift. I'd also like to recognize my two colleagues that are partners in this adventure here at the Clinton Center with me, Dr. Jay Barth, who you'll hear from later in the program, who is the director of the Clinton Library, and Dean Vicki Soto. And Vicki will be speaking later in the program as well. So we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Brinkley to the Clinton Center this evening to discuss his latest book, Silent Spring Revolution: John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening. It chronicles the rise of environmental activism during the Long Sixties, 1960 to 1973, telling a highly charged story of a generation that quite literally saved the natural world under the leadership of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. His book is a call to action, reminding us that there is still work to be done. Dr. Brinkley is the Katherine Tsanoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, Presidential Historian for the New York Historical Society, trustee of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He works in many capacities in the world of public history, including serving on boards, at museums, colleges, and historical societies. Dr. Brinkley's recent book on Cronkite won the Sperber Prize, while the Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast received the Robert F. Kennedy Award. And this is a big one. Just last week, he received a Grammy for producing the best Latin and jazz album, and I'm sure that Jay will dig into that a little further. He was telling me that as we walked down the stairs here, and I think that's pretty neat. So, our moderator, as I mentioned, is Dr. Jay Barth, the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. And before coming to the Presidential Library last March, he's been here almost 1 year, so I'm not calling you new anymore. Jay spent 3 decades teaching and researching various aspects of American politics and has worked to enhance civic engagement programming in higher education settings. Later in the program, he's going to take some of the audience questions that were previously submitted. And as I mentioned, we are just so pleased that Jay is a partner here, and he is doing some really incredible work on our civic engagement programming, so stay tuned on that front. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Jay Barth and Dr. Douglas Brinkley.
Well, Doug, welcome back to Little Rock and welcome back to the Clinton Presidential Center. And thank you for your flexibility. This was supposed to happen in December, and thanks to many of y'all who were planning to be here in December as well to come back tonight. So congratulations on this book, which is a truly stellar book. It's the 3rd volume in a series. You wrote 2 previous books on American presidents in the environment, one on Theodore Roosevelt, The Wilderness Warrior, and another on Franklin Roosevelt, Rightful Heritage. And so could you set the stage for this book by talking about those previous books and what they had to say about American conservation?
Well, thank you for hosting me. I love being in Little Rock, and I really enjoy the library here and also the legacy of William Jefferson Clinton, who also was one of our great conservation presidents who did so much, and maybe I can weave some of that in later on in our talk. But your question of how I got on this journey of doing a trilogy, not that you need to read the others to read this book, they're not connected like that. But when I was a boy, my mother and father, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. My mom and dad, we had a Pontiac and a trailer, and they were teachers. And we had many summers where we could go all over the country visiting national and state parks. So I had the privilege of, by the time I was 18 going to college, to have visited the Everglades and the Smokies, the Grand Canyon and Sequoia, the Olympics and Isle Royale in Michigan. And that kind of was my favorite thing, going to the parks. Now people do a thing called passports for the parks. They bring their kids and you check them off. But I was kind of a byproduct of that, and before it was called that. And I also had asthma as a kid. And I had read in a biography at a library that Theodore Roosevelt had asthma, but the natural world was a curative. He was born in 1858 in New York City, and pre anything being regulated, the air in New York was poisonous, and he would have respiratory illness. But when he got to the Catskills and the Adirondacks, it would lift. The science on all of this is indisputable that clean air is much better for your lungs than dirty air. And I started, wherever we went on these family vacations, I'd pick up brochures, as you did in those days, and either Theodore or Franklin Roosevelt had saved that place. And when I had my own children, I have 3. I have 2 in high school, 1 just started college. I wanted them to experience the parks, but I also wanted to write and be in my role as historian. So I stumbled upon the idea, nobody had written a big book on Theodore Roosevelt's conservation From 1901 to 1909, TR saved 234 million acres of wild America. He did it through many means. He created our National Forest Service of today, put Gifford Pinchot, the first head of forestry. So if you pull a Rand McNally map and just look at all these national forests, they're Theodore Roosevelt. He would go through Congress for national parks like Crater Lake in Oregon or Mesa Verde in Colorado. But he innovated two other things. He used executive power to set aside 51 federal bird reservations, some the size of West Virginia, for species survival. Never in the world had anybody did that. Those original 51 of Theodore Roosevelt have grown into today, you all own 550 national wildlife refuges, an incredible system with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. In addition to the Forest Service, and then what Bill Clinton stumbled upon is that Theodore Roosevelt, when he went to the Grand Canyon and they were going to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper, and the Senate said it's not worthy of National Park Service, TR said, God has made it, man will only mar it, leave the Grand Canyon alone. And he signed an executive order using Antiquities Act in 1906, which was really meant for about, let's call it 10 acres of dinosaur bones, and for Native American pottery or artifacts, because European museums were coming here and poaching all of our dinosaur bones. So the federal government could come in and put, like a yellow plastic of today, you'd see around a couple acres, and allow that to belong to the people if they discovered a T-Rex or rare pottery. Roosevelt applied it what would become 1 million acres, by finding that the president had the power to do it in the name of science. And when people said, how is that many acres science? He said, show me a better example than erosion at work than to study the Grand Canyon. And it went through the courts. They sued about it, and TR won. And Bill Clinton later will use that Antiquities Act to save many of our treasured landscapes in a very bold way as president, particularly in Utah. But and then FDR, his first big New Deal measure was the Civilian Conservation Corps, where we planted the United States in our country. The Great Depression wasn't just the stock market, but we were an agricultural ruin. We had drained our swamps, clear cut, all the hardwood trees. We had a dust bowl going on. Bird species, other species were vanishing, and FDR was able to, with his CCC, paying unemployed people $1 a day, plant nearly 3 billion trees. Billion around our country. And while I could rattle off all the national parks and things FDR did in his long presidency, he also was the progenitor of 800 state parks. So these are big conservation giants. And so I wrote one, then the other, but I realized that the TR was called, and I'm going to use the word environment. I know some people don't like it or whatever, because it was conservation. But let's just, to make today simple, environmental movements, we've had 3. Progressive era environmental movement, TR. FDR, and the third big one was the 1960 to 73. And it was a movement that had many people, not a Roosevelt, in front of it. And so I tackled it and went to where my research could go. I knew where it ended. It ended in 1973. The Endangered Species Act that saved alligator and California condor and wolves and bald eagle. I could go on. That, guess what it passed, guys? The U.S. Senate in 73, 92 to nothing. And Nixon had created the EPA, but by 73 we had an Arab oil embargo. Gas prices went up, inflation went up, and there became a movement to stop that third wave of environmentalism. Where I began the book was harder because it would have been a lot shorter if I started it in 1960 as originally planned, with John F. Kennedy running for president and environment becoming part of the Democratic Party plank, and Ansel Adams bringing out a great book, The Great Photographer, called This is the American Earth. And I could tell you other things that happened that year. But the truth was, it really began in 1945. in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because as FDR said, due to World War II, Dr. New Deal became Dr. Win the War. And we sped up any kind of chemical, any kind of pollutant, any kind of war munitions to win the war without thinking of the consequences is what it would do environmental. And so I begin in 45.
So we've got three presidents who we'll get to in a bit, but there's somebody else whose name's in the subtitle of this book, and of course that is Rachel Carson. And you identify the publication of Silent Spring as the moment when the modern environmental movement really began. But Carson had been around for years before that. And so could you talk a little bit about Rachel Carson's role kind of from her entrance into the public dialogue about the environment, of course, through Silent Spring?
Well, it segues nicely because Rachel Carson was a New Dealer, and then she became a New Frontier person under John F. Kennedy politically. But she grew up in a little town, Springdale, in Pennsylvania, along the Allegheny River. And the Allegheny River, due to a glue factory and other chemicals, had died. It was a beautiful part of Pennsylvania, but she, as a girl, wanted to play there, and she saw the pollution. Her love was for nature. She would collect, nests and leaves, and she wrote essays about, diaries about nature. She was a budding Henry David Thoreau, and she went to Chatham's Women's College, as it was called back then, and a very astute professor noticed she had two amazing skills. An A student, she was in science, biology, really smart, and yet wrote like an angel. And gave her guidance that just marry those two and it'll be something remarkable. Very few, Darwin could do that, but not many could do it as that well. And she decided she wanted to see the ocean. She got to go to Woods Hole. Woods Hole, Massachusetts is down the road from Kennedy's compound in Hyannisport. And it is ground zero for marine conservation, ocean studies back in the 20th century. Today's Scripps out in San Diego and Miami. There are other ones, but Woods Hole was it. It was the Carnegie Hall and Harvard of marine studies. And she started taking to marine biology. Her big early interest was eels, because many people wrote about migratory birds, but eels make journeys from Africa all the way to like a river in Pennsylvania. And so she started writing about eels, and then writing about sea urchins, writing about cod, shad. She got an advanced degree at Johns Hopkins in zoology. She became a columnist for the Baltimore Sun. She's a remarkable writer. To help the war effort in World War II, she wrote the scripts for radio about oceans and what was going on throughout the war. And in 46, she ran a thing called Conservation in Action, which was to document in little readable booklets she started writing and commissioning others to write how to save national or wildlife refuges, guidebooks about all of these places that we own. But after the war, she had two big concerns. One is at a place called Pawtuxet. I mean, she was working in government during the war and after the war, writing these pamphlets and things. But she found out the contamination of nuclear weapons. Hands-on. She knew how detrimental to ecosystems nuclear fallout from Hiroshima and Nagasaki were going to be. And in our giddy high of winning the war, and I would have personally think Truman made the right decision to end the war, but we're very careless about radiation and what happens with nuclear fallout. And we started blowing up bombs in the Pacific Island, where you have Pacific Islanders who got sick. And then we did nuclear testing in Nevada. From 1945 to 1992, the United States detonated 1,054 nuclear weapons. And most of these were above ground before Kennedy signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which I write about in my book, banning Russia, United States, and Britain from atmospheric and underwater testing. But from 45 to 63, we were blowing up nuclear weapons willy-nilly. If you went to Nevada, people were celebrating that we're the atomic state and do the nuclear boogie, and we were frivolous about it. But as Carson started seeing how dangerous radiation was, and she also honed in on how dangerous DDT was. DDT was a miracle of World War II. If I served in the war, like the presidents I write about in the Pacific, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon in the Pacific, they would have been sprayed with DDT. And good for them, they should have been. We should have used it because it killed lice and it killed mosquitoes and it saved our troops from malarial diseases. But the documentation started coming in that it would destroy fish, birds, and hence humans' exposure to DDT. But the U.S. government, Department of Agriculture, started spraying it to change crops forever in the South. If you go to Sumter County, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter's from, Jimmy Carter's father died of pancreatic cancer. His mother died of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy died of it, his sister Ruth, and his sister Gloria, because they were heavy spraying the crops with this DDT there. And these spikes in cancer, leukemia, and other ailments were prevalent if you got exposure. President Carter was in the Navy those years, so he missed that heavy spraying. So Rachel Carson, as an activist scientist, public scientist, was worried about nuclear testing, ban nuclear testing, and ban DDT, or at least find ways to control it differently. But that was just her activist side. She became famous writing the 3 most beautiful books about our oceans, a trilogy. If you haven't read, just pick any of them. The Sea Around Us is my favorite. They hold up today. They're timeless narratives by her. She was the Jacques Cousteau of literature on the oceans. Nobody's written more beautifully about them. It's remarkable. When we talk about nature writing as a genre, a lot of writers don't like that being categorized, but there's Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and Rachel Carson. They're like in a league in their own in American history. And her books became #1 bestsellers all throughout the 50s. Rose Kennedy adored them. Thoreau wrote a book called Cape Cod in addition to Walden, and there became a movement to save America's vanishing shorelines in the mid-1950s. And Jack Kennedy was part of it as a senator. Rachel Carson was a leader in it. The news media got involved with it. And by 1961, largely on the effect that Carson's book had to think about the beauty of our shorelines and seas in America, particularly the Atlantic and the Gulf, but also somewhat the Pacific, we started saving national seashores. John F. Kennedy saved Cape Cod in 61, Padre Island, Texas, Point Reyes in Marin County, California, are 3 of Jack Kennedy's. It's easy to save some mountain range in Alaska that's all rock. But you get into the seashore real estate, it's really expensive and hard. And so this movement that Carson was part of to do that kicked in. Meanwhile, by the late 50s, in addition to her ocean work, she finally decided there became a famous case by, anybody here remember the name Benjamin Spock, a baby doctor? People of a certain age do. Young people can be forgiven for not knowing him because, times changed. But his sister, Marjorie Spock, was in Long Island, and she sues Suffolk County, Long Island, and the USDA and others for spraying her farmlands because she was an organic farmer. Her role in life was to have organic produce, period. Now, if these crop planes are coming for insect control, she loses that ability. So she sued and said, I have a constitutional right to be an organic farmer. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and she loses. But William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, wrote a genius dissent saying that that was unconstitutional. She did have a right. Nobody should be poisoning lands. And meanwhile, Rachel Carson took all of those legal documents from that case. You can imagine how much got generated, a big Supreme Court case, and married that to reports that were given to her from inside government, whistleblowers at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, her old employer. And she started writing in the late 50s, Silent Spring. And at the exact time, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. and had radiation treatment after radiation treatment, chemo type things. She lost all of her hair, and she knew she didn't have long for the world. So there was a race for her to write this expose. It came out in 1962, and it became a revolution because for the first time, it wasn't Theodore or FDR planting trees or saving a beautiful, park. It was telling everybody here, your kid could be getting sick playing in the backyard. Mom and dad, your kids are being contaminated. That wakes people up. That opens up what may have been a clubby conservation's my thing, outdoor recreation's my thing, into something much larger, people's health, personal health. And we never turned back after that book came out. It had the smelling salt effect that few books have, like Thomas Paine's Common Sense in the American Revolution, or Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, or maybe Upton Sinclair's The Jungle on meatpacking factories. Rachel Carson's book, Married, Seashore Preservation, Conservation with Concerns over Nuclear Bomb Testing, DDT, and turned it into a public health crusade.
So you mentioned Justice Douglas, and he's all over this book. He's strategizing with presidents. He's working with grassroots activists on their efforts. He's, of course, once the environmental law movement gets going, he's still on the Supreme Court hearing some of those first really crucial cases. He's wearing all these hats, not always very publicly, and some might argue that in doing so, he may be crossing ethical lines in terms of getting on both sides of the game. Could you talk a little bit about him and whether you think he did kind of cross an ethical line?
Well, Douglas wrote, as from Supreme Court, I'm going to bend the law in favor of the environment against the corporation. That's a heavy line. And what he grew up in Yakima, Washington, and had polio type, crippling. Doctors told me he couldn't walk. He learned how to walk and then hike, and he became a great mountain climber. FDR loved young Bill Douglas, and so did John F. Kennedy's father. He went to Whitman College in Washington and Yakima, then hoboed like a Woody Guthrie vagabond, went to Columbia Law, ended up becoming the great Sterling Professor of Law at Yale, was considered a genius at law, but he got hired by FDR with Joseph Kennedy at the stock market to regulate it during the Great Depression. But he really is all about outdoor adventure and clean rivers, clean air, and that those are U.S. birthrights. That part of our Bill of Rights should be the right to clean air and clean water. And that remember, guys, when you're dealing with 1950s and 60s, there is no Environmental Protection Agency. There is no Clean Air Acts. There is no Clean Water Acts. We were just dumping stuff into the rivers. There became a smog crisis in 1948 in Donora, Pennsylvania, where the entire city got ill. Everybody went to the hospital. 20 people died. If you went to Donora, Pennsylvania today, there's a little mom and pop museum called the History of Smog Museum. But it was, some people remember, you couldn't even see Los Angeles, the mountains. It was so polluted. Pasadena, New York City, people sick. So Douglas's response was, today you might think he overdid it, but it was an alarming feel that we were rapidly, with all this unregulated industry and no sewage treatment plants and all, destroying America the Beautiful. He took Bobby Kennedy with them, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, hiking all over Siberia. And when Bobby got 104 fever and was sick in a village, Douglas, always a man of Darwin, like TR, said, well, Bobby, this is where we leave company. And he left Bobby there to fend for himself because the hike must go on. So he was wild. Bill Douglas, Ethel told me she wouldn't talk to Bill Douglas for abandoning her husband for years, but Bobby loved him. And he was an acquired taste, William O. Douglas. FDR wanted him to be his vice president over Truman back, and he could have been VP, came an inch away from it, Douglas, because Roosevelt said, I never saw anybody play poker better than Bill Douglas. He's a poker guy, and he gambled a lot. And his first big gambit we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. incidentally, famously said over and over again, the leading voice against nuclear testing was Coretta Scott King, banning the bomb. She'd go to Geneva on it. It was her passion. Dr. King said, what good does it do to integrate the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, if the milk we're drinking has strontium-90 in it, the fallout coming into dairy products from nuclear testing? And in this environment, Douglas also goes to the Himalayas and climbs and becomes a Buddhist. So we've had a Buddhist Supreme Court justice in the United States. It just doesn't get talked about. He had William Blake and Muir and people on his walls. And lo and behold, Bill Douglas's first big gamut is he does not want a road. He wants to save the C&O Canal in Washington. So he hikes 186 miles from Georgetown to Cumberland, Maryland. And on that hike, he brings people, the media follows him, and he kills the roadway. The Washington Post ends up siding with him. Even Eisenhower did. With that victory, Douglas now goes on protest hikes. He came to Arkansas, Bill Douglas, to go down the Buffalo River once he heard that people were putting barbed wire across it to stop kayaker canoers. He came and wrote, he was really the national leader of the Buffalo River preservation movement, along with the great painter Thomas Hart Benton, who's painted so beautifully the cliffs along the river, and others. But he'd also he'd hike with Bobby Kennedy and go along the Olympic with Ethel and Bobby and save the Olympic from a road. He'd go to Kentucky to stop a dam. He was unbelievable. And he'd write books called My Wilderness. And what gets odd is and crossed the line, he used his office in the Supreme Court as a clearinghouse for any environmental group. If somebody here had an environmental complaint in Little Rock, all you had to do was get the package to Bill Douglas. And so he was hanging out a lot with the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society. He was embedded with those guys. And until these federal laws came, he was determined to make them happen. So he's a great, colorful Supreme Court justice. He's the longest serving justice in U.S. history. He's controversial because he had 4 marriages. And the last wife, she's a great conservationist leader today, but she was in her 20s and he was in his 70s, and it created scandal in Georgetown. But he was a maverick kind of loose cannon justice who did more for the environment than just about anybody you could imagine.
So Doug, let's talk about President Kennedy a bit. And I think the last time you were in Little Rock, you were here with American Moonshot, your book, of course, on another aspect of Kennedy's New Frontier worldview. And how does his conservation work kind of fit within that broader perspective, or his broader perspective on the country and on the space race in particular? How do those things all fit together?
John F. Kennedy was not a workhorse in the Senate. He was more of a show horse. And Bill Douglas, who trained, the Kennedy family would have Uncle Bill Douglas over for lunch and bird watching, and he was almost an extended member of the Kennedy family. He's the one who came up with the idea of the Peace Corps, Bill Douglas, and got the Kennedy family thinking about such a thing. But he said, Jack, the problem is you haven't slept on the ground. You've been pampered. Now, Jack Kennedy had a horrible back. And the truth is, it's worse than we think, the pain John F. Kennedy was in. He couldn't go on these 186-mile hikes with Bill Douglas like a young Bobby Kennedy could. So Douglas said, well, Jack and the Senate, you got to find an issue. And Kennedy chose seashore preservation. I would ask all of you in the audience, what's your Walden Pond? What place in the natural world speaks to you the most? It could be the Buffalo River. It could be the C&O Canal. It could be your aunt's farm. But somewhere in your life, you were in the natural world and felt a kind of glow, almost a spiritual sense of God and the planet. And it became part of your own DNA. For Jack Kennedy, it was the ocean and it was Cape Cod. And he would, even in a doodling, he'd do sailboats in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he couldn't wait to get there because he couldn't do other vigorous sports with the back, but he could sail, and he was very good at it. And he went all over, and he felt that wilderness of the oceans. Lyndon Johnson felt that with the Pedernales River at the ranch in Texas. I'll tell you the Nixon story later. He didn't quite have a Walden. So Kennedy got very into the idea of saving these seashores. What was great is what he did was not just ocean seashores. His administration with Stuart Udall, who was the great Secretary of Interior for Kennedy and Johnson. Stuart Udall's son, Tom Udall, was a senator from New Mexico, and he's now our ambassador to New Zealand. But Stuart and Jack Kennedy came up with the idea of lakeshore preservation. The Great Lakes were being treated as a dumping zone, no national parks. And the poet Carl Sandburg and others said, why don't we have great national parks in the Great Lakes? It's magnificent. And if any of you have been to Upper Michigan in the summer or Wisconsin, you know how beautiful it is. And so Kennedy started moving, and due to Kennedy, some didn't get passed till Lyndon did the assassination, but they saved Sleeping Bear Dunes up in Michigan, Picture Rock, the Apostle Islands, 22 islands in northern Wisconsin, the dunes by Gary, Indiana, called Indiana Dunes near Chicago, on and on, protecting the Great Lakes in addition. So this was a passion of Kennedy. The second one, and Bill Clinton, I would say, falls right into this story, is wilderness. Wilderness was becoming big. The idea was with cars, roads, modernity, how are we going to save anything in the United States in its wilderness features? And so Kennedy became a leader of the Wilderness Act, which Lyndon Johnson would sign. That put 9.1 million acres of roadless wilderness. So the idea of if you don't put a road in it, you can't build it, you can't have features. So you could hike, hunt, camp, but it was really a lot of soldiers and people in the military loved going, and still do, into these wilderness zones. So Kennedy was pushing that Wilderness Act through too. And then clean air. In December 1963, we have our first Clean Air Act, but that act only deals with stationary pollution coming from factories. There was going to be a standard of pollutants. It worked, but it's not till 1970 that we get the second Clean Air Act of 70, which goes after automobiles, and particularly getting the lead out of gasoline. And the combo of those two has made Americans' air quality much better than it was. So if you want to look at political success, we're going to walk out of here tonight and be able to breathe and not worry too much about what we're experiencing, although there are some places like in California, in the Imperial Valley and all, where the air quality is horrendous right now. But these Clean Air Acts worked, and Kennedy was a big part of that too.
So President Johnson, I think one of your arguments is it's kind of under-recognized in terms of the impact he has with his legislative victories. I mean, why does he not get the credit that he, I think, justifiably deserves based on your analysis?
Kennedy was an intellectual. His hero was Robert Frost. You know Frost, the great poet, read at Kennedy's inaugural, and Kennedy promises kept and miles to go. And he was all about Robert Frost. He was one of the players of the environmental movement. And I mentioned the poet Carl Sandburg and Ansel Adams, the photographer. Native American tribes were coming out with environmental ideas. And as Udall put it, Kennedy opened the door enough at the White House so all these people could come through. They didn't rush through. They vetted who was getting through, but it allowed this sort of opening. So when Kennedy was killed when Kennedy was asked at the podium when Rachel Carson's book came out, they tried to malign Rachel Carson as being a lesbian, hysterical woman, fake science. Boy, you should see how ugly people were to her book on the chemical industries for fear of being regulated. And Kennedy, with great poise at a press conference, was asked about it, and he said, well, I've read the articles in the New Yorker, Miss Carson, and we're going to look into her research. He then put a scientific panel objective, best people from MIT and on. And they looked at all of her research, and a year later, the report came out and said Rachel Carson was right. So if you're in conservation, outdoor, environmental, you liken Jack Kennedy. His killing, he dies in Dallas in November 63, and then Rachel Carson dies in 64 from cancer. And there was a hole. And the thought that, oh no, Lyndon Johnson. Because Lyndon was a product of the big dams of the New Deal. He loved that Grand Coulee Dam and the TVA, as do I and as you should. They electrified rural electrification. There were magnificent public works projects. We can say that, but we could also say there became a lot of pork. A lot of congressional districts just wanting, I want 50 million for a dam that wasn't really needed because it's money to your district. Johnson was on that kind of program of, grab the money from the district, and he didn't show real environmental side to him at the time he became president, except he was married to Lady Bird. And Lady Bird was a genuine environmental land and water steward, outdoor person, in a very sophisticated way. She grew up on the Texas-Louisiana border. She learned to love swamps, bayous, of the area called the Big Thicket of today. And she writes beautifully about the natural world. And as a team, Lyndon and Lady Bird picked up the Kennedy torch and moved it even forward. When you're to Johnson's credit, he started looking at why is air quality where people of color live worse than where whites live. And with his Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts, there was a correlation to some of the environmental legislation coming out. But Lyndon and Lady Bird did things like she would go with Stuart Udall and go down the Rio Grande River at Big Bend. And then she campaigned for Redwood National Park. And if you go there today, it's the Lady Bird Johnson Grove. And she went down the Snake River in rafts. And she went all over and became the symbol of not only the national parks, but new conservation, the environment, got great press. Unfortunately, she would later say, Lyndon's boys made me call it beautification. So she gets quite, you'll hear people say she was about American beautification. She felt that was a little like putting, it sounded like a mortician or a hairstylist. She wanted to use the word environment, but the word environment was still a difficult word. George McGovern once told me when it was conservation, it was so close to the word conservative. Conservatives would sometimes go along with this. But the word environmental got politicized. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson did parks like Canyonlands in Utah or some redwoods, North Cascades in Washington, gorgeous national park. Many others. He did, Lyndon Johnson, our national trails, the Pacific Crest Trail, the Appalachian Trail, our whole federal trail systems, LBJ. And building on the Buffalo River campaign, started fighting for wild and scenic rivers, parts of rivers that won't get destroyed, that could stay swimmable, fishable, and clean. And today, this whole wild and scenic river system really should be named the LBJ, Wild and Scenic River System, because he put his heart into that, because he liked the Pedernales River, a beautiful river in Texas. That was his muse. So environmental and nature is sometimes emotive, and it brings out a kind of almost a religious feel in people that get close to it. And then Johnson did the first Endangered Species Act in '66. I could go on, but I will simply say the reason he didn't get credit, and he created National Historic Register and all this history sites, and Vietnam, I mean, if you're an academic looking at Johnson, and I'm a good-hearted person, so I'm trying to see all the good, but one could criticize him very easily for he was all about American beauty, saving American rivers and lakes. He did not give a damn about the rest of the world, Johnson. And you could see that in Vietnam. He would use Agent Orange, defoliants, kill jungles, He didn't have that environmental thinking like Bill Clinton does. I mean, Bill Clinton sees that everything's environmental. What isn't about air and water and food and species? And Johnson had more of a rancher's view of, I like ranchers who take care of their property, good land stewards, individual, with maybe hyping up the frontier values of American wilderness and he loved the parks and all. But Vietnam has destroyed much of that environmental legacy. And the beneficiary is Lady Bird, but Lyndon did an awful lot. And without his leadership, many of our environmental standards of today would never have come to fruition. So they were a real team, those two, when it came to the environment, because it was his wife's passion.
So President Nixon, obviously the president who's probably least naturally at home in this movement, right? This is not his calling, yet he had some of these amazing victories, including in many cases by overwhelming bipartisan, if not unanimous votes. A couple of things. First off, talk a little bit about Nixon and why he did go along with this movement in such an important way legislatively, but maybe talk a little bit about whether it's appropriate to see those as truly bipartisan, or whether there were some other things going on in that era.
Well, I mentioned DDT. So Rachel Carson came out in '62 talking about, not calling it banning, but saying we really have to regulate. This is not good for we call it the DDT wars. It went on for a decade. It's Nixon who bans DDT in 1972. After so much science came in, the bald eagle almost went extinct. The DDT would thin the shells of the eggs, and so our national symbol was headed for utter demise. That's just one, indicator species. But Nixon, the environment wasn't his bag. Okay, he didn't have that conservation thing, but he did come from California. And when he ran for president in '68, you couldn't get away from the environment. It was all over the place. I mean, it was talked about in the media so much. And so he hired John Ehrlichman, who you might know from went to jail for Watergate. Well, I'm now loved by the Ehrlichman family for being nice to him in my book. Because Ehrlichman went to UCLA and all this, and got his law degree, but he moved in Seattle and was the #1 NIMBY lawyer, not in my backyard. So if you were a wealthy community and didn't want an aluminum factory near your house, you'd hire Ehrlichman. And so the wealthy people, whether they're Democrat or Republicans, that don't want their neighborhoods being marred, kind of unify as a neighborhood. We don't want that built in our backyard. And Ehrlichman was very good at it. Nixon, he was a Republican. Nixon came up in like '62, and they went voting together. And he was impressed that Ehrlichman's doing this kind of environmental law and was making money on this. And so in '68, he hired Ehrlichman to be his spokesperson. And then, of course, he wins in '68, and Ehrlichman becomes the domestic advisor in the White House. And as the very radical David Brower of the Sierra Club said, we were lucky. Ehrlichman is a covert green in the White House. And he was. Covert green meaning Ehrlichman got it. He understood basic environmental principles that we all live with today. And it interested him. He was a hunt fish guy. Now, once I befriended the family, because they wouldn't talk to people for years, because the only questions any historian asked them was about Watergate, I got deluged with fishing photographs of John Ehrlichman. I mean, all over from massive catches. But Nixon's only president days, and the Santa Barbara oil spill happens in '69, and it was ghastly. Birds stuck in oil and goo, unable to fly. Television news went color in 1967, meaning the Cronkite broadcast went color in '67. Now it's early '69, and in everybody's living room in live color is Paradise, Santa Barbara in muck. And it sent a shiver through the national consciousness. Nixon did the right thing as any politician. He's like, don't blame me. I'm here 8 days. It's blame Udall and Johnson's people for giving these offshore leases. But and Nixon did something smart. His Interior Secretary went to the ground, Walter Hickel, and Hickel called Nixon from the ground during the spill and said, and I would tell any president to listen to this advice of Hickel to Nixon, don't minimize it. I know because we're friends with the oil and gas people, our first instinct's going to be, because they're our donors, is to say, this isn't that big a deal. It is a big deal. And let's just call it a big deal. We're not going to get blamed. We've been here 8 days. And Nixon did, and he got a pretty good response. And by the summer of '69, you're mentioning connection to space. All of the astronauts thought they were going to the moon, which they were, and they were mission moon, but they all came back and said, it wasn't the moon that surprised me. It's seeing Earth, the blue-green planet floating alone. And they kind of came back as conservations about the planet from their moon missions and for Project Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. But at the time Neil Armstrong went on the moon and Nixon was going to bask in the credit of it, Time magazine had the Cuyahoga River on fire in Ohio, and the Rouge River was on fire. And then a Gaylord Nelson, a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, hatches an idea in the fall of '70 for Earth Day. Let's, just like we had protests in the Vietnam, let's have a teach-in about Earth. And it's moving. Now, the thing I found out that fascinated me, because I know Gaylord Nelson and student groups came up with Earth Day, but more and more I saw all these college campuses having Earth Day offices springing up like mushrooms, just boom, 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 boom. Where did that money come from for all of that Earth Day offices everywhere? I mean, it was a large bankroll. Somebody paid for that. You can't open that kind of massive operation. And it boiled down to one name, Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers. Because in the 60s and 70s, big labor, Reuther's view on the environment was my worker in Detroit works in a factory, and he should deserve to have clean lake, clean river, clean air, and clean playgrounds. And so with Reuther funding it, there's movement going, and Nixon does not want to become the goat of the country, the non-environmental president. And you know who every day is criticizing Nixon on the environment and Vietnam? Ed Muskie, senator from Maine. Nixon, the man who keeps enemies lists, the man I've edited 2 volumes of the Nixon tapes. Nixon had one enemy above all the other enemies, Ed Muskie. Watergate may not have happened if Nixon wasn't paranoid that Muskie, who was running as Mr. Anti-Pollution, Mr. Clean, and all this was going to be who he had to run against. So he tells Ehrlichman, you guys, you and your enviro friends, I'll sign brazen environmental edicts if Muskie has nothing to do with it and he's not invited to any ceremonies. I don't want him in the White House. I don't want to see him. Well, you know who Ehrlichman was friends with in Seattle? Scoop Jackson, the senator who was pro-Vietnam War Democrat and an environmental guy. And Jackson had a crackerjack Senate staff, and they cobbled together NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And NEPA has affected all of your lives because it gave birth to the environmental impact statement. You can't build unless, by overnight, environmental law, you have to produce them. And so he signs it January 1, 1970. He gives a State of the Union, Nixon, on the environment that's epic, like half of it's on the environment. People are surprised. Earth Day's coming, and Nixon writes with Ehrlichman, it's a pinko commie plot. Nixon was worried that with Reuther and all these guys, he was going to be, no matter what he did, be seen as a non-environmental guy. And he thought Earth Day could turn violent. It could, Vietnam protest. So he did this. He planted a tree at the White House with Pat to show that he was in the spirit of Earth Day. He gave government employees the day off, Interior and elsewhere, to celebrate Earth Day. And he sicked the FBI on all of the student groups to do telephone bugging, wirings, and all. And historians like myself reread other people's leavings for a living. One of the funniest exchanges is Ehrlichman in the White House talking to Pete McCloskey. And McCloskey is Congressman Republican from California and says, you won't believe what I'm going in. You know, he told McCloskey, I'm going to see the president to tell him we've got the surveillance reports. And there was some nookie going on, some dogs, some frisbee in a little pot, a lot of fondling and nothing else. And he was laughing because Ehrlichman had to tell the boss, this wasn't a big plot. It was just a bunch of kids celebrating Earth. And that emboldened Nixon. And in the summer of 1970, he creates the Environmental Protection Agency out of the White House, working in collaboration with Henry Democrat Scoop Jackson's Senate staff and John Dingell of Michigan's staff. And the EPA opens the doors in 1970. And now Nixon is really a leader because he listened to the public demanding clean air, clean water, species survival, and the rest.
So I want to get a couple of audience questions, but one last question about the Buffalo River, which you mentioned before, and obviously I think is that incredibly meaningful place for many people in this room. My spouse knows some of my ashes are supposed to go at Sneed's Creek right off the Buffalo. Could you talk a little bit? It's one of the last acts in this book is the creation of the first national river. Could you talk a little bit more about the Buffalo?
Well, the
briefly?
Buffalo in Arkansas, and incidentally, Bill Clinton just loves I've spoken to him at length about the Buffalo River because he was with William Fulbright dealing with the Buffalo preservation of it. And it's such a magical river. And it was decided the National Park Service or National Parks. First one was Ulysses S. Grant, Yellowstone, 1872. Yellowstone, 1872. 1972, Nixon wanted to make a big statement, and he went in with the Buffalo River National River designation. And that started a wide that was a very bold and a big thing. But, many people joined that crusade. If you go to Bentonville, what's his name?
Neil Compton.
Yeah, Dr. Neil. And he was a huge leader on it. But also Orville Faubus joined the Save the Buffalo River campaign, more known as the segregationist governor. It had an unusual coalition of people that, in the end, I think did the right thing. But with Bill Clinton in Arkansas, I've had the privilege of talking to him because he loves conservation history and all. His love of the Ozarks, it's just unbelievable how much he loves this state. And of course, the movement in Arkansas was to become the natural state, as you all know, because the pride of the beauty of your landscapes and features here. And it's still, I think, what's so special about Arkansas. It's probably one of the most gorgeous landscapes in the United States. The area we're talking around Bentonville,
yeah,
and Eureka, and the whole bit, yeah,
indeed. So most of the questions that came from the audience, in many ways, tie the story that you tell about the Long Sixties to today. What are the lessons learned here on the policy front, on the advocacy front? I mean, what are the takeaways
my
from this
big
book for
takeaway
today?
is I told you we've had 3 waves. And under President Clinton, with saving of spotted owls in roadless national forests like the Tongass, we've got to, in Alaska, you got to be careful when we have these treasures that we can scream USA, we did it. We've saved these fish and wildlife refuges. We've saved these national parks, but we've got to protect them. And there's always going to be a want of a generation to go in and grab short term out of it. It's just human nature, but we've got to be adamant in protecting our parks and our outdoor resources. But we're looking for a 4th wave, and climate change is this trigger point. And climate change is the 4th wave. People thought maybe it was happening when Al Gore with Inconvenient Truth. There were still about 8 Republican senators for a while that were into the climate change, working, and it looked like we might make big progress. It's now unfortunately become very divided over the energy independence versus environment, and they're clashing. We don't need to go there tonight. We all know we're living this in America right now and what that is. But the fourth wave has got to be global. It's got to include, which makes it much harder, meaning with China's pollution, the horrific pollution coming out of China and India and elsewhere. But the big thing is it's got to come from the people. The politicians listen to the people. Nixon, for whatever circum, he heard it. We were demanding no rivers on fire. The Great Lakes, the novelist Kurt Vonnegut said, it's filled with human excrement and Clorox bottles. It was dying Lake Erie. Dr. Seuss wrote, Smeary Lake Erie, and eventually changed that book because grassroots people said, we want to be able to boat and swim in Lake Erie. It's still hurting Lake Erie, but it came way back. But the young people today at colleges that are into the environment are worried. They're feeling like the painting the scream, forest burning, wildfires, epic floods. It's out of control. And so my message to them sounds a little weird. Get involved, but have fun. Don't get psychologically distressed. Don't get despair. Feed off of optimism. And join. Just don't say, look at your laptop and say, oh my God, the climate crisis, we're doomed, da 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 da. Be active, adopt a friend, become a friend of the Buffalo River, become a friend of the park system of Little Rock. Work on a species salvation for the manatee in Florida, and give it as much time as you can. It might only be 2 hours a week, it might be 10 hours a week. And it might be your whole life and career, but be engaged, because as long as we don't let people run over our natural resources in a grotesque fashion, and we stand together that we love this country and its bounty and how beautiful it is, and we want to save it as TR said, the British have Westminster Abbey, the French have the Louvre. We've got the Tetons, we've got the Shenandoah Valley. Treat these natural places as our heirlooms for future generations. We're going to be okay, because the politics will shift out. I think it's less federal government now, although Biden's put his big plan through on climate and all, and that's all important. But individual states are taking it on. I spoke to the Rhode Island legislature and got a bipartisan applause in a very real way, because Rhode Island is ground zero for climate threats. Their shoreline's disappearing. Historic Newport's going to get wiped out. But they built a big wind farm and they're proud of it. And their companies are starting to get engaged, and they're going to try to make Little Rhode Island the engine that shows the country how a state can deal with the climate crisis by adaptation strategies, by river cleanups, by focusing on environmental justice issues, which I write about in the book with people like Dolores Huerta, who's in the women's display here, beautiful quilt, and Cesar Chavez and Dr. King, and the Black Caucus starting in 1971 got involved, and make sure no child in America is living in barrios or urban areas where there's asbestos or they're getting sick due to their environmental surroundings. So it takes a vigilance, but anger is not going to do it. It's more of a spiritual crusade, the planet, and just do your little part, and eventually all the parts will connect, and this fourth wave will kick in.
So Doug, one last question from an audience member. If Rachel Carson was attending this event tonight, would she feel uplifted by the environmental progress we've made, or depressed by the lingering climate change denialism, or both?
Depressed by climate denialism for sure, but she was very much in touch with, she was a bird watcher. And so species extinction and the rate of it going on right now and the struggle, that would have been very near and dear to her heart. And also oceans that we've used as just dumping zones for all of our industrial debris. That's a massive issue that she wishes, I'm sure, that we would do more with. But there's miracles out there in the nature. You can sit on and look at the sky, and I don't find the romantic aspect of the natural world to be fake or not real. I find it the great salve for all of our problems are there by respecting it. And she would want to get young people engaged because it's Generation Z now, guys. I'm a baby boomer, and we did our best. And this is a pro-baby boomer book, because I'm saying those people in the 60s and 70s, whether it's Senator Frank Church from Idaho or Lady Bird Johnson, we did do a lot. The EPA Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, air quality, a lot was done, but then we started getting lax. And it's time now for a new energy. And that's why young people took to Greta so much. They felt that she was of their generation. They want to, all we can do is be encouragers of them, because it's a very healthy sign if you have a granddaughter or a child who says, I love camping, I love hiking, I love the natural world, that means they love life. They want to keep things clean and beautiful and special, and it's a good human quality of being a caretaker and steward of our planet. So the more people that can be thinking and feeling in that way, the better off we're going to be as a species as a whole.
Awesome.
Humans. Thank you.
Thank you for writing this book. Thanks for spending this evening at the Clinton Presidential Center.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Douglas. What a treat, and what an incredible conversation where we get to look on our past with the lens of environmental activism, but more particularly, what I was struck with here at the end, Douglas, is the hope, where your call to action for our next generation is not one of anger, but of bridling that passion and doing something with that call to action. I am Victoria DiFrancesco Soto, and I am the Dean of the Clinton School. I want to thank you all for your attendance here tonight, and a special note of thank you to our Congressman French Hill, who we know is also an ardent supporter of conservation of the Arkansas beauty that we have here. I want to thank the Kumpuris family. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for your support of this lecture series of the Clinton Presidential Center. Please join me in thanking the Kumpuris Center, whose generous gift allows us to bring incredible speakers like Douglas Brinkley here. I'd also like to thank my friends at the Clinton Center, Stephanie Street and Dr. J. Barth, as well as the team that puts this all together. A special thank you to our core sponsor, AT&T. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for allowing us to build community. Please join us outside for a book signing. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next installment of the Distinguished Kumpuris Lecture Series. Have a good evening.